It has been my privilege over the years to teach Daniel and Revelation in college. As some of you know, I taught in 4 colleges over the years. And it was a thrill because I felt a call to this type of ministry when I was a teenager. And I'm very grateful to God that He allowed me to do it and that I enjoyed it so much. Our lesson on Daniel 11 brings us to the end of his book. And in order to understand the message of this chapter, we need to remember the format of the book. The book is divided into roughly two sections: historical chapters and prophetical chapters. The prophetical chapters are chapter 2, chapter 7, 8 and 9, 10 to 12, well, 11 to 12 mainly. Chapter 10 is more of a prayer. Each succeeding prophecy expanded on the material presented in the earlier prophecies. Let's not forget that, because in the history of the interpretation of this chapter, some of our folk have not always followed that pattern and have brought in other things instead. For a quick review of the week's lesson, we have in Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 to 3, mention of Persia and its great king, Alexander. That ties us in with the previous chapters, if you remember what we studied in those chapters, with the Medo-Persian kingdom, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, and papal Rome. Verse 4, we read that the kingdom of Greece divided into 4 divisions. Then from chapter 11, verses 5 to 14, we have a description of the conflicts between the king of the north and the king of the south. Now, if you go to the SDA Bible commentary or to Uriah Smith's book, Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation, you will have a detailed account there of what each verse is talking about. The lesson this week that we studied from our pamphlet did not go into all those details, and I don't intend to do it today. If you're interested in that, go and read the SDA commentary and Uriah Smith's book, and you'll get those details there, because they deal with a lot of history. But one thing is important to remember, and that is that the king of the north was the Seleucid kingdom, and the kingdom of the south was Ptolemy in Egypt, the Ptolemy dynasty. And where were God's people? Our lesson pointed that out very clearly to us this week, that God's people are in the middle, like the meat in the sandwich. And the conflict going between these two armies, from the north and from the south, affected God's people. And that brings me to a very important point when we consider Bible prophecies, and I've stressed this over the years with my students. Prophecy was not given to us to make us wise concerning political events that happen in the world, unless they affect God's people, the church. Then it is a legitimate application when it affects God's people. But there are many, many historical events that have no bearing on God's people, and the Bible prophecy ignores them. Some people ask, what about World War II, World War I? Were they prophesied in the Bible? Not specifically. Only in Matthew 24, where Jesus said there would be wars and rumors of wars. They fit in there, but not specifically, because they didn't affect God's people directly, as some other great events in history have done. Now we come to verse 15 and 28, and following the pattern of previous chapters, where the next great power was pagan Rome, we have a passage dealing with pagan Rome. We have the robbers of thy people mentioned, which some commentators have said were the Romans. We have he, which our lesson pointed out was Julius Caesar. Then in verse 17, we have the daughter of women, which commentators have identified as Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, who had dealings with Julius Caesar. Remember, she wrapped herself up in a carpet to get into his presence because otherwise her political enemy would have not allowed her to approach Julius Caesar. That's the way she got in to see him, was wrapped up in a carpet, and as a gift to him, and when he unrolled the carpet, there she was. Famous incident in history. And then the later dealings with Mark Antony, daughter of women. Then we have the raiser of taxes, which our lesson pointed out was Augustus, in verse 20. And in verse 21, we have Tiberius, a vile person who was on the throne of Rome at the time when the Prince of the Covenant, or Jesus himself, was crucified. Then from verse 29 to 35, we introduce Papal Rome. We read in verse 31 about the power that would pollute the sanctuary of strength. That reminds us about Daniel 8 and 9's prophecy, where the sanctuary was to be trodden down and the truths of the sanctuary hidden from men and women throughout history, and how the knowledge of that sanctuary messages was to be restored. And we have references to Jesus as Prince of the Covenant. And we have the mention of the Tamid. Now, that's an interesting word, the Hebrew word Tamid, which is translated daily in the King James Version, but in other versions is translated by, probably more commonly, the word continual. A lot of people have debated about what is the daily, what is this continual. Some have suggested it was paganism that was to be taken out of the way to make room for papal Rome to come. Actually, the word is often used in the Old Testament in connection with the sanctuary. The Tamid showbread, the Tamid lamps burning, the Tamid incense that was offered. It seems to me to be more referring to the sanctuary messages and what those messages teach us in our theology, and how during the Middle Ages, the papal power took away from men and women the knowledge of the sanctuary message and what it stood for, rather than looking at paganism. Then we have also the king, verse 36 to 39. And at this point, I'm going to call on the operators to put on the PowerPoint presentation. Now, I want you to know I'm of that generation that's not up in computers. I mean, I can do email and I can surf the net and some of the things I can't do on the computer, but I have a daughter that can do more than I can do. And so when I was lecturing up in Queensland some 2 or 3 years ago now, one of the men there said to me, "Why don't you put your studies on PowerPoint?" And I said, "I don't know how to." Well, he said, "My wife's an expert on it. You give us your studies and she'll put them on." So thanks to what he was able to organize with his wife, she put on the following program, which we'll put up on the screen in a minute or so, dealing with the history of the interpretation of Daniel, verse 36 to 45 particularly, which is toward the end of the chapter, dealing with aspects that have been sometimes interpreted in different ways and caused some conflict in the church at various times. If you go to Daniel chapter 11, verse 36, and I have to be careful with my Bible because my book of Daniel, the pages are just about shredded. They've been used so often that I have to be very careful in opening my pages here. Otherwise, I do further damage to what's already damaged. All right. We have the PowerPoint for the... Yes. Go to the next picture. I have to... Going to verse 40, but we'll come back to verse 36 in a moment. But verse 40 says, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." Now, as to who is the king of the north is the burning question that so many people have been asking. And so let's have a look at the... And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him. Yes, we just read that. In the early days of our history, Uriah Smith and James White were in harmony. And they taught that from verse 36 to 45 it was the papacy all the way through. But then Uriah Smith changed his mind and began to introduce in verses 36 to 39 that it was France that was the power being described, and that verses 40 to 45 was Turkey. Older Seventh-day Adventists who've studied Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith will recognize what I'm saying. Now, I've told my students over the years not to try and interpret Bible prophecies by reading the newspaper headlines. Herbert W. Armstrong has done that repeatedly, and to his embarrassment. When the headlines changed, he's had to change his interpretation. And sometimes when Adventists have done the same, they've also been embarrassed and had to change their interpretation. At the time of 1800s and 60s and 70s, a war blew up between Russia and Turkey, and Uriah Smith thought that there was going to be Russia take over Istanbul, the capital, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. And so he interpreted Turkey as the power that would be from verses 40 to 41. But he introduced in verse 36, where it talks about the king shall do according to his will, he introduced there, first of all, that it also was the papacy. Later on, he said it was France, and later on, he got Turkey into verse 40 to 45. This is a matter of history that anybody who's studied our history records will recognize what I'm saying to be factual. So let's look at verse 36. The king shall do according to his will. It doesn't identify who the king is. But in context, talking about the papacy just before that, scholars have suggested that the king should really be following on the power that is mentioned previously. Now, back in the year 1954, which is an easy year for me to remember because that's the year that I got married, and the General Conference appointed a special committee to study Daniel 11. Some of you pastors may remember the reports that were printed in the ministry magazine around that year, March of 1954. So there were three main periods of our church history where the pendulum has swung back and forth. So first of all, we have the papacy and its political supporters, who are identified as the continuing power in Daniel 11. As I said before, Uriah Smith agreed to that, and James White were in harmony. But when the war began between Russia and Turkey, around about 1870, I think it was, Uriah Smith changed his mind because he was reading in the paper about France and about Turkey. So he got up in a camp meeting and preached a sermon on the King of the North. And when James White heard that sermon, being in the audience, when Uriah Smith sat down, what did James White do? He jumped up to the pulpit and said, "Now, if you want to know who the King of the North is, you listen to me and I'll tell you." And he preached a sermon on papacy being the King of the North. And that led to Ellen White giving her husband a rebuke. Now, men, how do you feel when your wife gives you a rebuke? Well, I think James White, to his credit, took it on the chin because he stopped arguing about it. So we come to the second period of history where Turkey comes up as the King of the North, and Uriah Smith promoted it in his book, Thoughts on Daniel and the Revelation. Now, the reasons why that view persisted for many years. The Ottoman Turkish Empire was the view of A.W. Anderson in his book, Through Turmoil to Peace, supported this view. This view taught that the King of the North ended on the 11th of August 1840, based on Revelation 9:13 and onwards, the sixth trumpet. Well, somebody has some other views are not considered, have not been promoted now, so we won't take time about that. I remember my good friend and colleague, Pastor Alf Jorgensen, known to many of you, Bible teacher at Avondale for many years, a man with a mind like a lawyer. And he quipped one time about A.W. Anderson's book, Through Turmoil to Peace, and said, quote, his book created more turmoil than it created peace. So I don't find in recent times any support among Adventist theologians for that particular view. Let's look on. The history of the teaching of the church is in three main periods, as I said a while ago. One was the early period when they were in harmony, that Papacy was the king of the north. The king of the north is said to be the Papacy. There was general agreement on this point during this time. James White, Uriah Smith both taught it, and Uriah Smith applied Daniel 11:45 to the Papacy. You see this in his editorial in the Review and Herald, May 13, 1862, under the title, Will the Pope Remove the Papal Seat to Jerusalem? It's an article that he wrote. Second period, the king of the north said to be Turkey. This is around this time that Uriah Smith changed his views and began to teach Daniel 11:36-39, spoke about revolutionary France, and that Daniel 11:40-45 dealt with Turkey. He wrote up these views in his book, Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation, published by the Review and Herald, of which he was the editor on and off for many years. June 6, 1878, page 180, he wrote, we have reached the preliminary movements of the Battle of Armageddon. See Ministry Magazine, November 1967, page 29 and onwards. Reasons why Uriah Smith changed his views, written up in the Ministry Magazine for us. 1798, the Pope was taken prisoner by the French general Berthier. The Pope died in exile in France. In 1870, the Pope lost his temporal rule over the Papal States in the centre of Italy, which was taken away from him by Garibaldi, the Italian patriot that united Italy into one nation because it used to be divided. Secular opinion held that the papacy would never recover. It seems strange to us now that Smith would go along with this view, since Revelation 13 verse 3 says the deadly wound would be healed and that all the world would wander after the beast power. By introducing France, Turkey, and Egypt into Daniel 11, he made the prophecies seem to be current to people of those times, and thus more interesting and urgent. Smith did what so many others have done, that is, to try and interpret the prophecies by looking at the newspaper headlines of the day. The danger in doing this is that he forgot the prophecies. Prophecy was not given to us to make us wise concerning political events, but to let us know what is going to happen to God's church. Political events are sometimes covered in prophecies, but only if they affect God's people, as I mentioned a little while ago. At that time, Russia seemed ready to move in on Constantinople, and Smith thought that this move would lead to Turkey moving its capital down to Jerusalem. And Bishop Newton and Adam Clarke, in his famous commentary, and others had linked Daniel 11:40-45 to the Ottoman Empire. So it was an idea going around not only in Adventist circles with Uriah Smith backing them, but with other commentators as well. But not all of them said so, because I checked this morning with Leroy Froome's books, Prophetic Faith of Our Fathers, checked this morning, and there are quite a number of Bible scholars and preachers back in those years that was still saying that it was the papacy throughout Daniel 11:40 to 45. Many scholars of the day also taught that Revelation 9 spoke about the Ottoman Empire and that Revelation 11 dealt with the French Revolution. Thus, it was thought that these two chapters were parallel prophecies to those in Daniel chapter 11. Reasons why Smith's views became dominant. James White withdrew from the controversy following the rebuke from his wife for the sake of peace. You read that in November Ministry Magazine, November 1967, and Counsels to Writers and Editors, page 76-77. James White withdrew from the controversy for the sake of peace. White did not spell out his views as clearly as did Smith. Smith is undoubtedly a very good writer, there's no doubt about that. Smith wrote his views in the book, Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation, the title, which outlasted anything that White wrote up in a magazine. And that's important. In the days when you light fires to keep yourself warm or to cook in a wood stove, you use pages off a magazine to light the fire rather than tear pages out of a book, wouldn't you? So books last in a home much longer on the bookshelf than magazines do. So that's one reason why his book took over and influenced the church for so many years. White died in 1881, while Smith served as editor of the Review and Herald for another 8 years after White's death. Thus, Smith's views became the dominant interpretation until about 1952. And of course, I was around in that year, and I can remember the switch over more or less taking place. From 1952 to the present, the church almost unanimously is teaching that the King of the North, verse 40, is again the papacy. Reason for the return to the earlier position, you can read it in Ministry Magazine, March 1954, which I've referred to already. Note that this quotation is dealing especially with Daniel 11:36 to 39, but which states is also true about the King of the North as being the papacy. November 1967, the papacy is generally held to be the King of the North, and Armageddon is understood to be primarily the climatic struggle between the forces of Christ and those of Satan at the end of time. This is in the Ministry Magazine, quote, which gives you the church's position as the present time. The years between 1924 to 52 were transition years. A summary of Uriah Smith's interpretation of Daniel 11:36 to 45. Well, they've been applied to pagan Rome from 14 to 29, and then from 30 to 35, we have papal Rome. Then he applied 36 to 39 to revolutionary France, and then he went into Turkey for the rest of the chapter, 40 to 45. Arguments in favor of the papacy in Daniel 11:36 to 39. Daniel 11 is a parallel prophecy to chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8 and 9. They end with the papacy, so why shouldn't Daniel 11? The pioneers of this movement, the SDA Church, were for the first 25 or 30 years of our history unanimous in stating that papal Rome is the power referred to by the prophet Daniel in these verses. No other conclusion could be reached after a careful study of the literature of the church during this period. I'm reading from the Ministry Magazine. Thus, the king in Daniel 11:36 refers back to the antecedent power of the papacy and not to a new power, that is, not to revolutionary France. It is generally agreed among Seventh-day Adventist Bible students that the king of Daniel is 7:24 to 25 and Daniel 8:23 to 25 refers to the Roman power. Catholic power, which actually fulfills the prophetic symbols. It was the conviction of the committee that when the king is again mentioned in Daniel 11:36 and described in almost identical language, it could not represent a new power like France or Turkey. Note that in Daniel 7, Daniel 8, the papacy is referred to as a king. The parallels between the wording with other prophecies that clearly deal with the papacy also strengthen the argument. For example, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 11:2, 2 Thessalonians 2, and Revelation 13. Daniel 11:36, revolutionary France did not prosper till the end of time. Notice that it says that in Daniel 11:36, that this power, the king, would prosper till the end of time. Now, revolutionary France was like a a big explosion, and then it disappeared. But the papacy was to prosper till the end of time, so it fits in with the papacy there, till the second coming. Uriah Smith taught the phrase that the desire of women referred to the abolition of marriage as a Christian institution during the French Revolution. Many have believed the papacy is the subject of Daniel 11:36-39, have taught that these words refer to the practice of celibacy of the Roman Catholic priests. So here you have an interesting point. I'm going to take a little time now to divert and look at this expression, the desire of women. Those who held that it was France, like Uriah Smith, introducing France here, say this was the abolition of marriage as a Christian institution. But those that held to the view that it was the papal power said, oh, it's the celibacy of the priesthood. But I want you to notice the expression, the desire of women, not the desire for women. Not the desire of a man for a wife. What do women desire? And so when you do a word study of the word desire, you're going back into the Hebrew and you look it up in the lexicon and you find out that the word desire comes from the word chemdar. Well, that's an interesting word, chemdar. What does it mean in English? Well, let's go to some other verses in the Bible and see what it says. 1 Samuel 9, verse 20. When Saul was chosen to be king, remember he was hiding among all the baggage and the carriages and the horses and carts and the donkeys and all that. When they cast lots and took him to be the king, he was hiding. They went and found him and brought him. And what did Samuel say? Samuel said to the people, and on whom is all the desire of Israel, the chemdar of Israel? Used of a person, not of an abstract idea like marriage or celibacy. Used of a person, desire of all Israel. And another text where it's used is Haggai 2, verse 7, where it talks about the desire of all nations shall come. This was a clear prophecy when the temple was being rebuilt and Haggai was encouraging the people. Remember, some of the old men who had seen the temple that Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed wept when they saw how inferior the temple was that they were now building in the restoration. They wept. And Haggai came along and prophesied to encourage them and said, the desire of all nations will come to this temple. Who is he talking about? Jesus. Talking about Jesus. And Jesus came to that temple. It was called Herod's temple because Herod beautified it, but it was the same temple that was rebuilt after the restoration from Babylonian captivity. And Jesus came to that temple. And Haggai's prophecy was fulfilled. But the word chemdar used there is talking about Jesus. So let's have a look at this expression now. The papal power, it says, would not regard any god, nor the desire of women, would not regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor any god. You've got a statement about gods of the fathers, or any god, and in the middle, a statement about celibacy of the priesthood. It just doesn't fit grammatically. Context doesn't indicate that. But if you put in there that the papacy would have no regard for the God of his fathers, less regard for Jesus, nor regard any God, but magnify himself above all. You know, I've got Catholic friends that I've had, and I'm not against Catholics. Catholics make very good Adventists when they're converted. Yes, many of our members were once in that persuasion. But who do they pray to regularly? They pray to Mary. And a former Catholic, who's now an Adventist minister, told me that the reason why they pray to Mary is because if you get Mary on your side, he said, then she puts your request on to Jesus, and Jesus will never deny his mother. So that's the way to get your prayers answered. Address them to Mary, not directly to Jesus. But he goes on into there to say that a God whom his fathers knew not, he will honor with gold and silver and precious things. Some scholars and commentators have referred that to Mariology, the elevation of Mary. And if you've been following current political and religious history recently, you'll notice that recent Pope wanted to make Mary the co-redemptrix of the world, the co-redeemer with Jesus, elevating her to the fourth person, they said, of the Godhead. Now, if that isn't a fulfillment of that verse in Daniel 11, I don't know what is. Honor a God whom his fathers knew not. Possible reference there to the Virgin Mary. A God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver and precious stones and pleasant things. Arguments in favour of the papacy in Daniel 11, verses 40 to 45 now. I come to the last section of Daniel. Parallel prophecies we've seen from previous prophecies, so no need to introduce a new power. The hymn of verse 40 refers back to the king of Daniel 11. Note that some say that there are three powers in Daniel 11 verse 40. This line of reasoning is not warranted and is not accepted by most Seventh-day Adventist scholars. They see only two powers, the king of the north and the papacy and the king of the south, the main rival of the papacy in the last days. Bible prophecies point to the prophecy as a world power attacking God's people in the last days, as she did throughout the 1260 days of papal domination. All right. So we have an end of the king of the north in Daniel 11:45, parallels the fate of the papacy as seen in other prophecies. He shall come to his end and none shall help him. I'm jumping ahead down to the last verse. Yet he shall be broken without hand, I read in Daniel 8. Daniel 7, but the judgment shall take away his dominion to consume and to destroy it until the end. Daniel 9:27, that determined shall be poured upon the desolator. 2 Thessalonians 2:8, the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth and destroy with the brightness of his coming. Here are a whole list of Bible prophecies that deal with the demise of the papacy in the last days, around about the time when Jesus is coming. And the great city was divided into three parts, and great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. The 10 horns shall hate the whore and shall make her desolate, and naked shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. Here the nations that now at one time in the end will be supporting the papacy will eventually turn around and destroy it. Reward her even as she rewarded you, and double unto her double according to her works. Fill to her double, so much sorrow and torment give her. Her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine. She shall be utterly burned with fire, for strong is the Lord God that judgeth her. So the question of the north, what does it mean, the king of the north? It stands for the power that persecutes God's people. Our lesson brought that out this week, so I'm not going to enlarge further on that, but just to point out that in Syria, Rezin was an adversary of Israel all the days of Solomon, and Naaman's campaign is mentioned. Assyria came in from the north with Tiglath-Pileser and took captives. Babylon came out of the north. It says, an evil shall break forth, the kingdoms of the north. But where is Babylon? North of Palestine? No, way over in the east. Yet it came in from the north. All these powers came down from the north and affected God's people, you see. And so Jeremiah, I will bring evil from the north, great destruction. For evil appeareth out of the north, and great destruction. The people cometh from the north, they are cruel. Talking about the Babylonians. The great commotion out of the north country. Nebuchadnezzar and armies out of the north. So the north becomes a synonym for the enemy of God's people in the last days. And according to all the other prophecies that we've looked at, that is the papal power. Backed up with apostate Protestantism, as you have in Revelation chapter 13. More verses dealing with the north. A whole lot of them there. Whirlwind out of the north. Whirlwind's a sign of war. I'll remove from me the northern army, and so on. Alexandria came in from the north. Seleucus attacked from the north. Pagan Rome came from the north. Now, let's have a look at the papacy here in these verses. Who is the king of the south who attacks the papacy till the time of the end? Now, here's where I have to take my own advice. And that's why I'm not going to be dogmatic like some people are. We all agree, virtually all agreed, that papacy is the king of the north in the end chapters of the book. But I have in my hand here a little book by Rosenberg, Islam and Christianity. And some have said that this Islam power is the king of the South. Well, I'm watching it, but I'm not going to dogmatize about unfulfilled prophecy because that's not safe to do, as I've already pointed out to many of my scholars, many of my students. Don't look exclusively at newspaper headlines. It's not always safe. So watch and see what is happening. But some have thought that the king of the South was atheism. In fact, you got that in our Sabbath school lesson this week. Maybe communist atheism. See, atheists don't have an army, but communism was atheistic. And communism is not a threat like it used to be, but it was a big threat years ago, days of the Cold War. But what about the Islam? Is Islam a rival to the Western powers today? Yes, it is. And here's something that might sober our thinking. The worldwide growth of Islam. I've got friends in America that send me material from time to time, and here's an email that I got from America. The birth rate among European people, that is white European people, has gone down. To keep a population at the same level, each family needs to have 2.3 or so children, because replace father, replace the mother, and then 0.3 to replace the infant deaths and so on that happen in some families. So to keep the population the same, you have to have 2.3 children. France is breeding at the rate of 1.8. They're not replacing themselves. The UK at 1.6 per family. They're not replacing themselves. Greece, 1.3. Germany, 1.3. Italy, 1.2. Spain, 1.1. Even Catholic countries are not producing the next generation large enough to replace themselves. And there's a lot more information on this that some of you might like to look at if you see me afterwards, because we don't have time this morning to go into it. But one thing that alarms me is what I've received from this document and what we've heard about, the thousands of Muslims that are flooding into Europe. And they are not breeding at less than 2 per family. They're breeding at 5, 6, 7 a family. And outbreeding the whites. And Gaddafi has been claimed to have said, we're not going to take Europe over by force of arms. We'll take over them by outbreeding them. And that's virtually what's happening. Holland today is largely, or almost, a Muslim country. Sweden, they say, is lost. And other countries, in Antwerp, the city of Antwerp in Belgium, I'm not talking about the countryside, I'm talking about the city. 50% of the children in primary school in Antwerp city are from Muslim families right now. Now we've got great work we've got to do for the Muslim people. They need the gospel, and the gospel is going in some quarters of the Muslim world. Like, we don't hear very much about it, but I have contacts that tell me it is going ahead, and many Muslims are becoming Christians in countries. And so, what is the final message that I can give you as a result of our study of this wonderful book of Daniel throughout this quarter, and especially this last chapter? Well, the king of the north is going to be attacked. Who by? We'll wait and see. But certainly a great war, because he responds with horses and chariots and many ships. Now, the Vatican doesn't have an army of itself, but it relies on armies of the countries that it dominates, and overflows and takes over a large portion of the countryside, according to Daniel 11. And then it has a control over matters of silver and gold. Look at Revelation 13. Neither buy nor sell if you don't have the mark of the beast. And tidings from his king of the north, tidings out of the north, trouble him. Titles from his own ranks will trouble him when the latter rain is poured out, and thousands are joining the Adventist church in the last days. That's not going to make him very happy. So he goes forth with great fury to destroy many, Revelation 13, the death decree. I see it all there in Revelation chapter 13. May we all be true and faithful to the message that we have been given, warning the world, the coming of Jesus, and prepare for that great event is my prayer. Let us pray. Father in heaven, we thank you for prophecy and what it reveals to us. We pray, Lord, that you will grant that we may be true and faithful to the messages that you've given us, preach the three angels' messages, uphold truth, draw men and women to Jesus, the Saviour of the world. We ask it all in his name. Amen.